Hi, I'm Ben Feinstein. I'm majoring in history and minoring in Russian and philosophy here at SMU. I'm originally from San Antonio, but SMU and Dallas has been great to me. The history professors here are absolutely fantastic. They've done a tremendous job in teaching us how to analyze primary sources and secondary sources really rigorously and put them together into compelling arguments for us to use in our works. I've been working for CPH since March of 2021. I've been working with Dr. Paul Behringer on U.S. Russian relations under Presidents George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin. It's been the best student job that I could ask for, and it really brought my time at SMU to the next level. So the program has really prepared me as a young historian going into this field. We've interviewed 32 officials and commentators in both the US and Russia, including former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Their accounts in these critical years are offering historians going forward a really valuable insight on 8 fundamental years in the US Russian relationship, which for obvious reasons today is extremely important to study and fully understand. So I've gotten a huge amount of experience as a young historian working in this job in terms of things like processing interviews, processing transcripts up to a really professional standard, conducting oral history interviews, which is a skill all of its own, as well as doing the intense background research that we need to guarantee a high quality product. This job has given me exposure to all of that. However, I think the area where this job has done the most for me is in terms of my studying abroad in Kazakhstan. Using the background knowledge that I gained from this job, I applied for and won a Department of Defense Boren Scholarship to study in Almaty, Kazakhstan, where I lived for an entire academic year. Many of the conversations I had with people there on politics, on the state of the world, on the relationship between the former Eastern Bloc and the United States really echo discourse that we've heard throughout this project from both US and Russian officials. So my being armed with that knowledge going in was huge for me to be able to get the most out of that experience. My time at SMU and CPH has been absolutely wonderful. I couldn't really have asked for a better undergrad experience for an aspiring historian. I'm extremely excited to serve my country in the Department of Defense come January, and I want to thank SMU for the time I've had.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you to our student for telling us a little bit more about the work that he's done with CPH. We're very pleased and proud, of course, to do all of our work with our postdoctoral fellows, but it occurred to us a few weeks ago when we were talking about ways to improve our ever ongoing series of events that we don't spend nearly enough time talking about the work that we do with undergrads. So we're hoping to rectify that. And that was our first go at it. So if you'd like to know more, please give us a holler. We'd love to tell you more. But tonight we're here to talk about Jonathan Hunt's brilliant new book on the Nuclear Club. I am absolutely thrilled that we're having the opportunity to have Jonathan Hunt come and talk to us about this book. I encourage you to go grab a copy. It's amazing because it's not just about what I think is probably the most important idea and most important technological advancement of the 20th century, the advent of nuclear weapons. If you've seen Oppenheimer, you know why. But also, more importantly, this is really a book about the formation of the post-war international order. That international order that, of course, seems to be ever under stress, certainly under stress today as much as any other time. And I, for one, am looking forward tremendously to Jonathan's presentation and to learning even more about this great topic and this important book. So let me briefly introduce to you who you're going to be listening to. That is Jonathan Hunt. He is currently an assistant professor at the Naval War College. He actually has the distinction of being not only involved with the Naval War College, but he previously taught at the Air War College. I guess now all you need is the Land War College and you'll be all set. That's the Army, in case you're wondering. And he also, of course, has had fellowships at Harvard University, at Emory University, at Stanford University. He has a PhD from the University of Texas and actually also an undergraduate degree from the University of Texas, and is a native Texan as well. So there's that going for him as well. I know I'm excited to hear what he has to say, and I'm going to ask Jonathan, therefore, to come on screen so he can take it from here and tell us all that we need to know about this important topic, the Nuclear Club.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction. I am very pleased to be in the state of Texas, at least virtually, tonight with you all. And I thank you for joining me as well as the Center of Presidential History to hear me talk about my new book, The Nuclear Club: How America and the World Policed the Atom from Hiroshima to Vietnam. I should mention as I share my screen, and hopefully this is the right, the right button to click. So hopefully you all see the first slide of my PowerPoint, the Nuclear Club. I should mention, as Jeff noted, I teach at the U.S. Naval War College, where I'm an assistant professor of history and strategy. And for this reason, it's important for me to note just kind of a typical preamble for those of us who work in professional military education, that the views expressed in this talk do not reflect those of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government more generally. I'm speaking purely on the basis of my own scholarship, the arguments and interpretations that I have developed over the course of my research. Although they may speak to issues with which the U.S. government is concerned, nonetheless, I speak only for myself. Now, in order to get us in the frame of mind to understand the moment that my book is really interested in, that of the 1950s and especially the 1960s, a period in which the U.S. government, often in coordination, sometimes in contest with other governments around the world, would create what scholars now refer to as the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. On the morning of May 8th, 1968, Walt Rostow, who was President Lyndon Johnson's special assistant for national security affairs, was delivering the commencement address to an institution not unlike the one I teach at. I teach at the U.S. Navy War College. He was speaking to the National War College in Washington, D.C. And he asked the assembled graduates, most of whom were officers in the various U.S. military services, how long it would be until, quote, Germany, Japan, Italy, India, and others build the atom bomb. Now, even then, about 100 miles north in the Manhattan neighborhood of Turtle Bay, international diplomats were putting the finishing touches on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear
Jonathan,
Weapons. This
is Jeff speaking
yes.
again. Could you double check? I think we're not fully seeing your slides.
Okay, let me stop the share and I'll try this again. Let's see. How's that?
There we go. Now we got it. Thank you.
And you see a very handsome man wearing some eyeglasses that are very much a product of their time. That is Walt Rostow. And so Walt Rostow, famously national security advisor to Lyndon Johnson for most of Johnson's presiding over the Vietnam War, is asking these assembled officers, many of whom would go on to command in Vietnam, how long they thought until Germany, Japan, Italy, India, and others build the bomb. Now, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, he related, had been described or characterized by the U.S. Department of State, of course, the chief diplomats for the country, as, quote, an exercise in U.S.-Soviet détente. That is a good deed in a naughty world. But for Rostow and others who were like-minded in the Johnson administration, the NPT instead represented a combined effort with Moscow, in fact, to halt, quote, the potential diffusion of power at its most important point. And he put a sort of final touch on it by linking this campaign, the shared superpower campaign, to halt the spread of nuclear weapons to new countries and connecting it to the war in Vietnam, stating that he and Johnson were prepared to lock the United States and its expeditionary forces, quote, into responsibility in the world, right around the periphery of communist China and the Soviet Union on the toughest of all issues. Now, the Nuclear Club is an entry in what is already, I think, a pretty well-stocked bookshelf on the history of nuclear strategy, the nuclear age and nuclear diplomacy. But previous books, for instance, Mark Trachtenberg's Constructive Peace, Shane Maddox's Nuclear Apartheid, very, very dissimilar in their own ways, focused primarily on U.S. motivations and in particular on U.S. sources. Trachtenberg and others explaining the ways in which nuclear non-proliferation diplomacy, first with a limited test ban treaty passed by Kennedy in 1963, then the NPT under Johnson in 1968, aimed first and foremost at preemptively disarming Germany. Germany very much the cockpit of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, and what many US policymakers considered and strategists considered to be the most important region in the world, that of Europe. Shane Maddox, by contrast, really alleging that kind of cultural blinders on the part of US political elites led them to seek to deprive others of that which the United States took advantage of. To, as I heard one policymaker once describe it, preach from the bar stool in advising others to forego the absolute weapon that the United States relied upon for it and its allies' defense. Now, my book, The Nuclear Club, seeks to connect this story of nuclear nonproliferation to a burgeoning, and at this point, kind of decades-long literature, decade plus, that seeks to internationalize, to sort of decenter U.S. foreign policy to some extent, to look at the ways in which relations between countries other than the United States. Good example, we have Jeremy Friedman's book on the Sino-Soviet competition for the Third World. Of course, Arnie Westad's absolutely landmark Global Cold War, which emphasizes to a far greater extent the proxy wars, the civil conflicts, and the wars of choice, the small wars and the limited wars that characterize the Cold War, where previous literature had very much emphasized how during the Cold War a major conflict was averted, at least among nuclear armed states. So the Nuclear Club, it makes a series of arguments. I'm not going to bore you with all of them today. I'm going to emphasize instead the domestic politics of nuclear nonproliferation and the ways in which it would further empower and entrench a powerful executive. But just for purposes of sneak peeks, for those of you, and I encourage you all to go out and buy a copy from your local Amazon, more than likely. The first argument that the book makes is that whereas scholars, whether in IR, security studies, as well as historians, have emphasized the importance of a nuclear revolution, right? To speak succinctly, that the invention of nuclear weapons more or less put an end to a kind of conflicts on the scale of the First and Second World Wars. The Nuclear Club asserts that while this is true, just as important was this campaign of nuclear nonproliferation that sought to nip in the bud the universalization of the nuclear revolution. This gets into some bigger theoretical debates about nuclear weapons, but I think it's clear from archival records as well as simply the course of events that nuclear nonproliferation has legitimated in some cases coercion, of course sanctions against many countries, as well as some wars of choice, most famously or infamously in Iraq. Second, that this turn towards global nuclear diplomacy, which would eventually create this global nuclear regime, was driven by fears that these territorial disputes, whether over a divided Germany or over post-colonial territorial disputes, whether the Israel-Palestine conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict more broadly, the status of Kashmir between Pakistan and India, the status of Taiwan, and the contest and friction over the Taiwan Strait. All of this led not only US officials, but international elites and publics too, to very much fear how the introduction of nuclear weapons, whether by the superpowers or by local, by the countries in the region, could lead to a nuclear tipped Third World War. Third, that the legitimacy, and this is, when I give talks to say, every 5 years, there's a review conference for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'll try to remind those who are currently tasked with sustaining this global understanding. And it's important to keep in mind the scale of this global understanding. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is second only to the UN Charter in terms of the number of nation states that have signed and ratified it, making it, in essence, the most significant security treaty in existence. That bargain within it and the legitimacy, the kind of sustainability of that bargain resides not only in the text of the treaty, something international lawyers concern themselves with, but also the effectiveness of the nuclear orders, both global, but also in these various regions that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty helped coalesce. Fourth, and kind of to return to a point and ultimately the rest of my comments today, that non-proliferation helps we as concerned citizens, as well as historians, to understand how what John Lewis Gaddis dubbed the long peace, the non-event of a third world war since 1945, how it connected to civil conflicts, covert operations, proxy wars, wars of choice, both during the Cold War as well as after. And in part, this is by associating, by exploring this almost institutional connection between the imperial presidency, which Arthur Schlesinger, historian in the Kennedy administration, would use to describe the Nixon administration, but actually that, at least in my eyes, it predates it, that we really see it emerge during the Eisenhower, but especially Kennedy and Johnson administrations, as they begin to recast the American presidency and the office as the president as a kind of father protector, not only to America's booming suburbs in the 1950s and 60s, but ultimately to humanity writ large. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about this connection between the international politics of nuclear nonproliferation through the concept of a rogue state. This is a bit of an anachronism. It's really not coined until the 1990s, 2000s, but I think it nonetheless explains the way in which nuclear weapons, the spread of nuclear weapons to new powers was framed and understood both by people in the United States as well as people around the world. Then I'm going to speak about the emergence of this paternal presidency, how nuclear weapons and the spread of nuclear weapons helped Kennedy and then Johnson to legitimate negotiations with the Soviet Union. Up until that point, really archenemy number one. But also perhaps the somewhat cynical reasons that Lyndon Johnson in particular, would embrace nuclear statesmanship in order to perhaps draw attention away or to counterbalance his degrading reputation over the war in Vietnam. From there, I'll talk a little bit about interpretation. How do we understand, how do we narrate the creation of this global nuclear regime? Was it a kind of consensual, universal arrangement among equal partners, or should we see it instead as a part of a larger Pax Americana that would be created during the Cold War and would survive arguably up until the present? And then I'll leave you with a few themes and lessons, just hopefully to get the Q&A going. So as I mentioned, the concept of a rogue state, that phrase is an anachronism. It wasn't used in the 1950s and 1960s. It tends to be associated with the debates over, in particular, sanctions against those believed to be pursuing nuclear weapons in the 1990s, Libya, North Korea, but Iran and Iraq, perhaps foremost among them. But in the 1950s, this was, if you would ask, really anybody, not only in the United States, but around the world, who was the chief rogue state, they would have told you it was the People's Republic of China. Now, to switch gears for just a moment, I wanted to explain where the idea of a non-proliferation treaty comes from. So I've already mentioned the significance of this treaty, the most important security treaty of the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. But it comes out of from a very interesting source. In this case, the foreign minister of a neutral, small, Western, post-colonial Republic of Ireland. And so the first proposal for what was then called a nuclear restraint comes out in the summer and September, so summer and fall of 1958. And it comes from a person that the British at one point considered a terrorist, Frank Aiken, a former member of the Irish Revolutionary Army during the Civil War, goes on to become a member of Sinn Féin, ultimately foreign minister. And Aiken, I think in line with his Republican convictions, very much sees the United Nations as the highest form of perhaps a provider of law and order worldwide, but also as a kind of expression of the highest ideals of Western civilization. In the summer of 1958, you have a series of crises. During the Cold War, these crises tended to happen in twos and threes. In this case, you have the fall of the Hashemite dynasty in Iraq, leading to British and American interventions in Jordan and Lebanon, respectively. But a month after that, Mao Zedong orders 2 offshore islands located in the Taiwan Strait shelled by the People's Liberation Army, leading Dwight D. Eisenhower to dispatch what was then, I think maybe still to this day, the largest armada ever assembled. Not 1, not 2, but 3 U.S. Navy carrier strike groups. And then lastly, a crisis over Berlin and its status, whether or not Khrushchev could unilaterally, in essence, hand his portions of East Berlin over to the East German government, which of course was a huge problem for the NATO allies because they didn't recognize the German Democratic Republic. So into this maelstrom steps Frank Aiken in September of 1958. In large part because each of these crises had a nuclear component, gave rise to fears that local conflicts could spiral into a worldwide superpower war. And so he calls on those assembled in New York in the General Assembly to answer this question: how to build a world order in which our disputes are resolved by common authority through international force. In short, how to preserve a Pax Atomica, a peace based on nuclear deterrence, while we build a Pax Mundi, while we build world peace under world government. Now, as I mentioned, it was this concern about Cold War flashpoints that really motivated Aiken, and I think made his proposal so appealing to many delegates to the United Nations. Stating here in 1960, it took him, he advocated on behalf of this, what came to be called the Irish Resolution, over the course of 4 General Assemblies from 1958 to 1961. Basically, it met opposition from the superpowers who were concerned about their ability to define their own nuclear relationship with their allies. The United States, perhaps the more obstructive of the two. But nonetheless, this belief that, as he suggests, controlling the incidence of flashpoints, how many nuclear tipped flashpoints there were, could stop the development of situations in which, quote, the nuclear powers might become too deeply involved and from which they could not retreat without a loss of prestige. Now, Aiken and those like him who were seeking some limit to the nuclear arms race, to the spread of nuclear weapons, very much did confront those who placed a different significance on nuclear weapons. In 1957, on the sidelines of an international meeting of communist and workers' parties, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party of China, the People's Republic of China, would have a conversation with his ally, the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, in which he would argue that the use of nuclear weapons, even all-out thermonuclear war, would in fact be a boon for the communist movement, stating, and this is written in as a kind of retrospective, that if half of mankind dies, the other half would remain while imperialism would be destroyed. Only socialism would remain in the world. In another half century, the population would increase maybe by more than half. Now, it's easy to see this as a kind of perhaps cold-blooded or highly ideological read on nuclear weapons. Mao Zedong elsewhere had dismissed them as well as American power as, quote, paper tigers. I think it's clear that he was capable of using his remarks to perhaps bluff his opponents and even his friends. But it did tap into a kind of larger debate or perhaps point of view that argued nuclear weapons actually threatened industrialized powers more than developing countries, most of whom are located in what was then known as the Third World. In essence, W.E.B. Du Bois, famous African-American civil rights activist, as well as socialist, would argue that it's actually these industrial powers that are most threatened. In part, for the most part, because their populations were more urbanized, they were more concentrated, industry still located within the city limits, rendering them far more vulnerable to nuclear first strikes. So there is a kind of logic at play here. Mao Zedong, however kind of chilling his comments might be, nonetheless was linking in his comments nuclear weapons to his idea of a people's war, the ability of the downtrodden seeking to throw off the shackles of imperialism to fight and win against better armed industrial powers, in part because they had less to lose. Now, for others, this presentation of kind of, nuclear risk-taking was both anathema as well as an opportunity to burnish their own credentials as statesmen and as leaders of the world, of the free world. John F. Kennedy very much was willing and open to the proposals being made by Frank Aiken. In part, this may have been due to their shared Irish heritage. It was certainly something that Frank Aiken used in his when he prevailed upon Kennedy to ultimately support the Irish resolution. It finally passes the General Assembly, not coincidentally, in 1961, after Kennedy becomes the youngest president in U.S. history. But it's also because the United States and the Kennedy administration are beginning to view the Cold War increasingly through a third world lens. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1963, the Pentagon would do kind of a tour de horizon, assessing the threats posed to U.S. security and power, stating that the Cuban Missile Crisis had, quote, indicated an unsuspected degree of Soviet readiness to exercise a kind of flexibility with which the U.S. had not previously been confronted. What was more, they faced incredibly complex military challenges in the Middle East, mirroring those in Western Europe, namely the possibility of nuclear proliferation. Beyond the Middle East, they state that problems of still greater complexity arise, going on to say that Soviet nuclear power extends to large reaches of Asia and the Pacific. And moreover, last but certainly not least, with or without nuclear weapons, Communist China represents a continuing threat. So, what to do? Other historians, Bill Burr, Gordon Chang, have written about sort of early planning within the Kennedy and Johnson administration to actually launch a preemptive strike against Chinese nuclear facilities. I think it's clear, at least from my research, this doesn't go very far. Even as willing a hawk as General Curtis LeMay, the head of Strategic Air Command in the U.S. Air Force, would essentially state that a preemptive strike could never happen without the say-so, without the acquiescence of the Soviet Union, which Kennedy and Johnson never received. But as an alternative, the U.S. State Department essentially conceives of a plan by which to use Mao's remarks against him, to paint him and the People's Republic of China as untrustworthy and irresponsible nuclear actors. Of course, this is also coming from voices outside the United States. In particular, India is very much concerned about a Chinese nuclear breakthrough. There's reports, conversations we have between the Indian diplomat and the Soviet ambassador in New Delhi that the creation of a Chinese nuclear weapon would be really a demonstration, quote, in the eyes of Afro-Asian countries, and would create a negative reaction for China and her neighbors. Very much speaking, one can presume of his superiors back in New Delhi, but also from the point of view of the U.S. government, in particular the Pentagon, the fear that the world was becoming less manageable, less defined by this U.S.-Soviet struggle with which they had grown accustomed. That, however frightening Soviet power was, it was the devil they knew. There is a memorandum in the summer of 1963, title of which, "Can the genie be put back in the bottle?" Can the genie be put back in the bottle, stating explicitly the world is no longer bilateral. And then, in fact, the acquisition of 5 small nuclear weapons on the part of communist China would be seen as far more threatening than the acquisition of 5 large thermonuclear weapons on the part of the Soviet Union, sort of laying the groundwork within the US government for outreach to Moscow in order to tie Beijing down, and in particular to paint Beijing as a rogue state. Here on the slide, I have a quotation from the Arms Control Disarmament Agency, and essentially describing a novel coalition to marginalize the People's Republic of China. The United States, the Soviet Union, major US allies, as well as many of the key non-aligned countries. Among the non-aligned, of course, India featured prominently as a leader. They were joined by Yugoslavia, by Egypt, as well as Indonesia, as well as others. And this is where US policymakers very much are pushing on an open door. Indian representatives convinced their non-aligned brethren to essentially add nuclear non-proliferation to kind of their larger doctrine of peaceful coexistence. So alongside mutual respect for territorial integrity, non-aggression, non-interference, mutual benefit, and peaceful coexisting, they add nuclear non-proliferation, in essence, to call out the Communist Party of China. This passes in late October of 1964. A few weeks later, China tests its first nuclear weapon, joining the ranks of the nuclear club, very much under a barrage of propaganda offensives by the Soviet Union. This is, of course, at the height of the Sino-Soviet split, the United States, as well as non-aligned powers led by India. So here we have the language from the second non-aligned summit in Cairo, Egypt, urging all states to conclude non-dissemination agreements, and for their own part, on behalf of non-aligned countries with whom Communist China often sought to make inroads, a readiness not to produce, acquire, or test nuclear weapons. Now, this is where I switch gears a little. This campaign to sort of marshal world opinion against Communist China on the eve of their first nuclear test, ultimately, it does succeed in creating the conditions in which a treaty prohibiting nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space is open for signature in August of 1963. Ultimately signed by most of the world's countries, provides really a stick with which to beat Beijing over the head for violating, for testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Also quite important to remark that this limited test ban treaty, as per the title it's often described as, was limited. It did not include underground testing, which is where, in particular, the superpowers continue to refine and advance their nuclear weapons program. But for Kennedy, and we'll see its effects on Johnson, there nonetheless remained the need to convince the American public, but in particular the US Senate, their representatives in the US Senate, to ratify the treaty. Of course, this should all be familiar. Treaty power, the power to negotiate treaties, lies in the executive branch, but the US Senate nonetheless has to ratify them in order for them to be incorporated into US statute. And so for the White House, for President Kennedy and his vice president turned successor, Lyndon Johnson, as well as for Attorney General Robert Kennedy, multilateral nuclear non-proliferation, first through the Limited Test Ban Treaty, then the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, offered 2 invaluable benefits. The first is providing a focal point for recasting the US presidency from a kind of Cold War commander-in-chief. Of course, 5-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower is a good illustration of this, from a commander-in-chief to a kind of more general guardian to the nation's suburban families and the human family more broadly. Kind of a more humanitarian, image that would connect perhaps nuclear non-proliferation to humanitarian interventions, of which U.S. military interventions after the Cold War would often be legitimated by. This is, of course, taking place against the backdrop of U.S.-Soviet détente, as well as the Americanization of the war in Vietnam. Second, this nuclear guardianship provided a means of absolving the sins of U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia. As baby boomers grew to political maturity, they went from elementary, middle, and high school into colleges, eventually allowed to vote. Voting age is 21, it's brought back to 18. But foundering ultimately on the anti-establishment and anti-war zeitgeist of the late 1960s and 1970s. So in the 1950s, I was just watching Apple has a new series called Monarch, which is based off of this kind of monsterverse that originates with King Kong and then the character of Godzilla. And one of the things I love to, kind of force on my students is the importance of nuclear culture to figures like Godzilla. Actually, a monster that, if you watch the original Japanese film, it's created by U.S. nuclear testing in the Pacific. It's a kind of reference to Castle Bravo, this huge 10 megaton thermonuclear test that irradiates a Japanese fishing vessel, one of whose crew members would eventually die. They would all go back to Tokyo, triggering just massive anti-nuclear protests. I think at 1.10 million people marched in the streets against U.S. Nuclear testing. And this is a phobia that's really kind of racking American parents as well. This is a point in time where you have a massive expansion of parenthood. The national census between 1950 and 1960, so just the span of a decade, adds 29 million young children. This is 29 million. Can't tell you what the number of new parents were, but this was a potent voting bloc, an unprecedented rate of demographic growth, most of which is taking place in America's booming suburbs, whose size and segregation in the Sun Belt and elsewhere made them pivotal for any candidate for national office. And this would remain true even after LBJ passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 83% of those 29 million babies are in the suburbs. So this concern about nuclear testing, about the way in which it spewed out radioisotopes, things like strontium-90, cesium-137, iodine 131 into the global atmosphere, which eventually would be circulated globally, mainly in the northern hemisphere by the trade winds, would descend in the form of precipitation, entering the food chain through the soil into plants, which would be eaten by cows, and eventually find their way into milk that would be consumed by these 29 new children in the suburbs, by these baby boomers. And so for Johnson, as well as figures like Benjamin Spock here, really considered one of the first child kind of experts on child rearing, not only would he reinforce kind of seemingly common sense views about women's roles in the home as well in society, but he would also draw this really bone-hard association between nuclear testing and the vulnerability of suburban children. This is a real source of political strength that Kennedy would take advantage of. He would use it to explain U.S.-Soviet détente to American audiences. One of the most celebrated addresses of Kennedy's tenure, that at American University, he speaks to a peace that makes life on Earth worth living, to build a better life for their children, stating in his peroration, "We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." This is June of 1963. The Limited Test Ban Treaty would be finalized in Moscow in August of 1963, very much in part because Khrushchev sees this speech as a sign of a potential diplomatic opening. Again, as I mentioned, though, even once the treaty is finalized and open for signature, Kennedy still has to convince a U.S. Senate that has grown used to appeals from the military-industrial complex for more and more funding and fewer restraints to convince senators to ratify it. One of the, I think, cooler archival finds I came across in the Kennedy archive in Boston, Massachusetts, was this handwritten note where he states, really kind of in brief, his game plan to go to the nation, to go to the Senate, diminish danger, war by other means, fallout, radiation, children, the protection, the preservation of the next generation, requiring, justifying US-Soviet detente on this issue of nuclear non-proliferation. And these tropes and these symbols of nuclear guardianship remain very useful for first Kennedy and then Johnson. 1964, Johnson faces Barry Goldwater, somebody who speaks perhaps far more cavalierly about the potential battlefield use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice presidential candidate, would state that Goldwater had made, quote, millions of Americans uneasy and apprehensive about placing his nervous finger on the nuclear trigger. And Johnson would use this concern about Goldwater's nuclear sanity, if you will, to devastating effect, and perhaps the most infamous campaign commercial in American history, which I'm going to play for you now. This is the Daisy ad. It only played once because it was enormously controversial, but I think only once was required. So hopefully this will work and everybody will hear. Let me know if not.
The stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
A little heavy-handed, but you have to admit, enormously effective among suburban parents who feared for the future of their children, for their well-being and for their potential. Lyndon Johnson, there's a whole kind of deeper history as to why the US and the Soviet Union take a number of years to come to an agreement over the text of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. It has to do essentially with nuclear weapons and NATO. But in the fall of 1966, facing a midterm election on which the LBJ's Great Society would be essentially up for a vote, the Johnson administration identifies a nuclear non-proliferation treaty as a way to win over, to answer some of the budding concerns of the American electorate about the prosecution of the war in Vietnam. There's a memo written by two of LBJ's politicos, Bill Moyers, kind of one of his chief speechwriters, stating that a political consultant, Fred Dutton, who had helped with all of Kennedy's campaigns, believed that the president, quote, is in serious trouble, that we are going to get clobbered at the polls this fall, and that there is a serious need for new initiatives. I do not, of course, mention the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to him, but this would precisely fill the bill. Now, what's more, for Johnson, this was an issue on which he felt a real acute challenge in the form of JFK's younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Of course, LBJ, unelected, elected on his own right in 1964, had embraced much of perhaps Kennedy's policies, but less perhaps of his, more superficial appeals. I mean, he couldn't replicate Kennedy's youth, his vigor, but he could replicate this kind of paternalism, this kind of father protector to the nation and the nation's children. RFK, however, had, of course, a stronger argument to represent Kennedy's legacy. His maiden speech to the US Senate would be on the occasion of the anniversary, the first anniversary of the ratification of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, speaking very much in those terms of the American University speech. We preserve the air we breathe, the health of our children and our children's children. And so with the midterm election looming in October and November of 1966, you get a series of memoranda preserved in the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, with Moyers and other politicos repeating, quote, "The gut issue is a non-proliferation treaty. The Russians have told us they would sign if we guarantee no, essentially, hardware solution, a nuclear arsenal for NATO. This may or may not be, but an offer by the president certainly puts him on the side of the angels." And they cite polling, they explain the logic, the desire to demonstrate statesmanship in much the same way they drew a contrast between Goldwater's nuclear recklessness and LBJ's nuclear statesmanship. Now, I've talked for about 43 minutes. I've got more to say about the finalization of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, what it meant at the time. Ultimately passes in June of 1968, roundly supported in the UN General Assembly in the form of about 95 votes for, with only 4 against, 21 states abstain. Ultimately, it's a treaty that perpetuates the status quo, that brings some perhaps a measure of order to what until that point had been a kind of nuclear anarchy. But it was nonetheless one that, like the Limited Test Ban Treaty, asked far more of non-nuclear weapon states than it did of nuclear weapon states like the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. Very much in the 11th hour, facing a potential, at least a less overwhelming vote in favor, even the possibility of a vote, really a kind of consensus that would fail for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. A Mexican diplomat, Alfonso Garcia Robles, would propose a set of 4 amendments. Some of them, fairly superficial, some more profound. A preambular reference to the prohibition on wars of aggression, wars of choice in the UN Charter, the fullest possible exchange of essentially equipment and knowledge about peaceful nuclear activities, the creation of an international P&E service. This is a bit of a relic of its time, essentially using nuclear explosives to, for instance, create a new canal in Central America. Mercifully, a proposal that ultimately was not made good on. And then lastly, and most dramatically, that the language in the NPT that called on nuclear weapon states to negotiate, quote, in good faith for nuclear arms control and disarmament, for it also to call for a nuclear freeze, for an end to the manufacture and perfection of the existing nuclear arsenals. Leave it to be said, this was the only amendment, the only proposed amendment that was ultimately denied. So I mentioned themes and lessons. I'm happy to talk about any of this more in Q&A. Just a few that I want to highlight. The first is that the Vietnam War, somewhat ironically, is what creates the necessary breakthrough, in particular for agreement between Moscow and Washington for a non-proliferation treaty over the heads of the West German government in particular, keeping in mind West Germany very much seen as the keystone of U.S. security policy in Europe. But it also limited the final scope of the treaty, in particular by leaving out promises on the part of nuclear weapon states not to use nuclear weapons against those who forewent them. Second, that suburban families, scientists, and peace activists created this, again, bone-hard link between the modern American suburb and nuclear restraint over the course of the 1950s and 1960s. But they did so in a way that was successfully co-opted by 2 presidents, first Kennedy and then Johnson, justifying detente with the Soviet Union in the face of domestic anti-communism, but also empowering the office of the president to wage wars of choice in the name of nuclear peace. So with that, I'll conclude. I'll thank you for your attention and welcome your questions.
Jonathan, that was fascinating and very interesting and really quite illuminating on the amazing intersection between the domestic and the foreign in the formation of this treaty. I'm going to ask you a couple questions to get the ball rolling, but let me suggest to everyone and remind you that we would like to hear your questions. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice the Q&A function. Please, if you would, write your question in there, which I could pose to Jonathan. And then also there's an interesting function in this program in that you can actually give a thumbs up to somebody else's question. I don't think you get a chance to thumbs down. You get a chance to thumbs up anyway at somebody else's question to kind of boost it up and let us know that this is something that you're interested in as well. So I'll give you all a few moments to type in your questions, but let me start with two, actually. The first is you did a marvelous job, of course, of describing the way that this desire for nuclear non-proliferation was a domestic political issue as much as an international one for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Obviously, the contexts are completely different when we talk about the Soviet Union, but could you say a little bit about what was motivating Soviet policymakers at this time to go along with this treaty?
Thank you, Jeff. It's a great question. It's one that has actually been obsessing me for about the past 6 months, in sort of cahoots with Joseph Torigian, who's a professor at American University. I think he's on fellowship at the Hoover Institution this year. He was able to bring out, with the help of a research assistant, just a big mass of Russian language Soviet era diplomatic documents from Moscow. And he managed to do it just before the war in Ukraine kind of put an end to the archival accessibility in Moscow. And so pouring over these, I'd argue domestic politics, perhaps less important for Soviet leaders. Even allied relations, I would say, were more significant. But this kind of brewing and eventually exploding rivalry with communist China, the Sino-Soviet split. I think that I see that really as the origins of the Soviet interest in nuclear non-proliferation. It's certainly not a coincidence that this interest and eventually this really called rapprochement and eventually common cause with the United States comes about as China is getting closer and closer to a nuclear capability. It's a very much a basic nuclear capability. They only have sort of short and medium range delivery systems. It's really no certainty that it would survive any kind of first strike. And then, of course, famously, ultimately, the Soviet Union invades parts of China over a border dispute over the Amur River in 1969 and approaches the Nixon administration and asks whether they would look the other way if the Soviets were to destroy the Chinese nuclear facilities. So I think to some extent there was concern about the eventual security threat that a Chinese nuclear arsenal could pose to them. Of course, they're located, they share a border with China where the United States never has. But in the context of the time, this Chinese nuclear capability really doesn't have much reach until the late 1970s, early 1980s. And even then, it's a sort of a fraction of the size of the superpower arsenal. So I really see, I think, this growing Soviet interest in non-proliferation as more about their prestige within the international communist movement and relatedly the non-aligned movement, that it had to do with their status as a responsible global power and leader. And keeping in mind, this is China at the height of the Cultural Revolution. This is a time when, except for perhaps national revolutionaries in wars of national liberation, China very much seems like a rogue state. And so, domestic politics, I think, was less significant. Politics within the international communist movement, and as well as sort of the hearts and minds of neutral and non-aligned powers, I think that was more decisive for first Khrushchev and then Brezhnev and Andropov.
Interesting. I really think our students today, maybe the general population, but certainly our students today, don't really have a great appreciation of how difficult the Sino-Soviet split was and how tense those relations were. I always think back on the fact that Beijing had a massive underground tunnel network of bomb shelters, which wasn't there for the Americans. You know, it was there
Yep.
to in case of the Soviets. So let me pivot a little bit to ask a question, which I'm actually going to combine a question from one of our postdoctoral fellows, Augusto Del Olmo, with one that had been going through my mind, but curiously enough, same question, two different locations. She wants to know about the development and the reaction, the global reaction, especially in the context of this treaty, to South Africa's subsequent development of a nuclear weapon. And of course, it's then elimination of its nuclear weapon program. And I was actually curious about the same question for Israel, which of course still does not officially have a nuclear weapons program, worst kept secret in the entire world. But from what we understand about this program, really comes into being in 1967, 1968, or at least the first weapons are available to Israeli policymakers in 67, 68. So really at the exact same time that these negotiations are going on. Could you discuss for us those two countries, and also in particular what American policymakers were thinking about those two developments simultaneous with their negotiations with the Soviets and other great powers?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Augusta, as well, for two pertinent and penetrating questions. Israel. I'll start with Israel, if only because, as you noted, the Israeli nuclear program is reaching maturity just as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is starting to really come into focus. And one thing that is always, I've yet to get a good answer to it. We have some outstanding historians of the Israeli program, which is, talk about cases. It's up there with North Korea just in terms of archival access. I mean, I guess North Korea is probably still more difficult, but it's not easy. They keep a pretty strong lock on their nuclear secrets. But Israel, according to, I think, a few historians, Avner Cohen, as well as Or Rabinowitz at the, I think the University of Tel Aviv, I could be wrong about her affiliation, but it seems to have had one or two explosives during the 6-Day War. And there may have been a plan. Seymour Hersh writes about the Samson option, which is basically the notion that, IR theorists call it a catalytic nuclear posture. Basically, the idea is we don't have enough to win the war. We don't have enough to deter the war. But if we blow a couple of these things up in the Golan Heights, the United States is going to have to come down like a barrel of bricks on whoever we're fighting. That they'll be forced, in essence, to intervene on our behalf by our use of nuclear weapons. It'll just escalate it in terms of global importance and urgency. And the striking thing is, why are certain countries considered to be lawful nuclear weapon states and others are considered to be unlawful? It's whether or not you tested before. I want to say, I hope I don't get this wrong. I think it's New Year's Eve, could be New Year's Day, 1967. And I'll have to go back and look at the treaty. I think it's New Year's Day. So Israel misses this by 6 months, right? And so I've always wondered the counterfactual, if they had nuclear weapons and exploded one before the end of 1966, would they be considered one of the 6 nuclear weapon states, official nuclear weapon states? Or would the superpowers, the main negotiators, have just changed the language in the treaty? Because it's a date that actually antedates, right? It comes before the treaty is finalized and open for signature. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations helped the Eisenhower administration. When Kennedy enters office, right, you always have those meetings between the outgoing president and the incoming president. They have a sit down in the Oval Office in early January of 1961. And Eisenhower, half the time, is talking about the Israeli nuclear program. And Kennedy bends over backwards trying to get Israel to accept U.S. observers in order to reassure Nasser that Dimona, which is a French-built, and Canadian-fueled, and so it's a whole global market too. It's not like the United States is the only player in this realm. And the Israelis, for them, it's a matter of life and death. So, and nationalism. That's something you can never discount when it comes to nuclear weapons. There's always a way in which nationalists love a nuclear arsenal because it says that their nation, right, belongs at the highest table. So de Gaulle in France actually has a lot in common with Israel. Basically, the French and the Israeli programs both come out of the Suez crisis of 1956 because they feel abandoned by the United States. So Israel, it's frustrating, I think I began life writing this dissertation and then book as very much like pro nuclear non-proliferation, and I still am, even as I perhaps understand its contradictions and its omissions and its second and third order effects. But like Rostow, who is Jewish, mind you, is writing Johnson and just begging him to lean on the Israeli prime minister to get them to come clean about the non-proliferation treaty. Likewise, as they're finalizing the treaty in New York, like the Black African states are basically telling the US negotiator, hey, unless South Africa says it's going to sign, there's no way we're going to go along with this. And it even gets wrapped up in a controversy at the time over Namibia, right? Over South African control over what was then, I think, Southwest, or, you know, the British had called it Southwest Africa, eventually gains independence as Namibia. And, you know, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So the South African program comes later, really into the 70s and 80s. It's ultimately seen as one of the great victories in the non-proliferation regime because South Africa gives up its nuclear weapons. But, you know, it's, you know, the clear-cut case of nuclear reversal. Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan are a little more complicated because we don't know whether they ever had command and control over the Soviet weapons. But, you know, basically the apartheid government dismantles their 6 atomic bombs. Again, this catalytic posture, basically we'll use them and the Americans will be forced to come in and save our butts. You know, pardon my French. But they dismantle them because they're about to hand the government back over to, you know, the African National Congress. And they cannot abide the African National Congress having control over nuclear weapons. So that's its own fascinating chapter, and I really recommend the work of Van Wyck. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna kick myself for not remembering her first name. But it's a great South African scholar who's written a number of articles about the South African program. So sorry that went on for a while.
No,
they're both fascinating cases.
But you raise a really interesting point, which is that in all of these cases, and I'm glad you mentioned the nationalism in particular, nationalism is a driving force for these states, even beyond what you might consider to be realpolitik or consider to be an assessment of their strategic impairments, imperatives, I should say. You know, and I'm curious, you know, how does that apply going forward? Because we know that several of the subsequent states, India, Pakistan, do of course see these as not just part of their own existential requirement, but I think especially in the case of Pakistan, if I understand correctly, you know, part of the existential requirement is demonstrating that we can do it too. And even more so than using it is having it. And I'm curious if that is an evolution from the initial states. I mean, obviously the Soviets, when they first developed their atomic bomb, are thinking about it not only in terms of prestige, but in terms of defense. But it seems like prestige for these countries has gotten greater and greater and greater as a component of the need for nuclear weapons. Maybe everyone since the Israelis, might I postulate.
Yeah, and I think this is where, you know, there's a famous article by Scott Sagan, who was, you know, one of my advisors at Stanford, about like 3 models in search of a bomb. Do countries pursue bombs for status? Do they pursue it for security purposes? Or do they pursue it because of bureaucratic politics? So like scientists want to build a bomb, or scientists want to pursue nuclear power. And so they tell their political minders they're going to build a bomb so they can do the science they want to do anyway. And as an historian, one of the great things is I don't have to be wedded to a theoretical perspective, right? And just the Cold War history it's messy. It's messy. Like, I think you go back to the 50s and 60s, it's not just Israel and South Africa, it's Brazil. It's Japan. Japan certainly has the capability, even despite their Hiroshima, Nagasaki nuclear allergy. It's Australia, Egypt, Israel, India is very much seen as probably the one that's closest, along with Israel. China, of course, nuclearizes in 1964. Sweden is capable. I mean, and the funny thing is, most of the countries that are capable of building nuclear weapons are either advanced US allies, right? Like Germany and Japan, this is not an issue for them. The 2 former Axis powers. Italy as well. They're more than capable of building a nuclear arsenal. And then these kind of pariah states with which the US will be burdened in the 1970s in particular, as the UN turns against US leadership. Israel, South Africa, Taiwan, South Korea to a lesser extent. So, it's a fascinating kind of Cold War history. Nationalism, in some cases, it is security. Like Taiwan is security, right? It's just Israel. I think it's clear to say security plays a role as well. They can get rolled over. They have no defense in depth. So I get to be sort of open-minded Catholic about these sorts of explanations. It depends on the country and it depends on their strategic circumstances, whether they have the luxury of nationalism, if you will.
Let me ask you a question, if I could, about your work both at the Air War College and at the Naval War College. I mean, obviously, I'm aware that you're a historian, and consequently, you're engaged primarily in dealing with things that have happened and thinking about things that have happened to give lessons for today. But how much time, and I realize there are a variety of different programs in each of those colleges, so feel free to answer however you like, in which level you were working at. But how much time do current military officers in their professional training deal with nuclear issues? I mean, I would tend to think that would be a rather specialized training.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you put your finger on the button, so to speak. One of the things that shocked me when I started, I was at the University of Southampton for 5 years teaching British undergraduates, and then I went to the Air War College in Montgomery, Alabama. And so the Air Force is, along with the Navy, the two services most responsible for the nuclear enterprise, right? For the deterrent enterprise, because they own the air leg of the triad, which is the long-range bombers, B-52s, B-1, B-2s, and now the B-21 Lancer. Navy, of course, the submarines, the boomers, but then the land-based ICBMs are also Air Force property. So you would think the U.S. Air War College would, spend quite a lot of time talking about deterrence, or even just talking about, the various complexities of the nuclear enterprise, command and control, C4. I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to it. But, early warning satellites, allied relations. One of my colleagues there taught an elective, and to get people to sign up, he called it "Everything You Need to Know About Nukes to Get Promoted." which should give you an idea of how marginal actually. So when I arrived there, I created 2 new, we call them instructional periods. And my students are, they're mostly older than me. They're 05s and 06s. So that's lieutenant colonels and colonels in the US Army and the Air Force, commanders and captains. So some of these people could, helm a US carrier. And we didn't have an instructional period on the Cuban Missile Crisis. They had one, so I don't want to speak ill of my colleagues. And one of the reasons I was hired was to remedy perhaps this institutional, I don't know, I'm not good, I'm trying to be diplomatic, this institutional shortcoming. But, it's enormously important, and it's increasingly important. Part of the reason, actually, I'd say 90% of the reason, is the war on terror. Right. So for the past 20 years, professional military education in the United States, and this is, every service, even the Space Force has professional military education now, has been focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, counter ISIS, Syria, Libya. I probably missed a couple. Other than nuclear terrorism, nuclear deterrence is not a large component of this. You look at the war in Ukraine right now, though, and I guarantee you the highest councils of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are talking about nuclear deterrence regularly. You look at the potential for a shooting war with China over the South China Sea or Taiwan. That is a nuclear crisis. It is just inherently a nuclear crisis.
But I wonder, in a sense, if that isn't, just to push on this issue a little bit, because it's really important, if that isn't, in essence, above the average military officer's pay grade, including those who are general officers. My recollection from dealing with the Air War College in particular was that the curriculum was designed to think about strategic allocation of resources on a theater level. But there is a sense in which nuclear weapons remain, I don't want to say taboo, but perhaps a whole nother dimension, which is beyond what no military officer can order their use. So
no, none
why
can.
bother
And
teaching
that has
them?
been a closely guarded prerogative of the US president. I make this argument in my book that, keep it short and sweet. Essentially, US presidents have had a humanitarian concern with nuclear weapons from the beginning. And one way in which they have expressed that humanitarian concern, you can go back to Truman after he learns that Nagasaki was just wiped off the face of the earth. As far as we can tell, he did not know that was going to happen. He learned about that in the papers because the US military at that time treated the atom bomb just like any other weapon. It did not require presidential delegation or authorization. After Truman learns of the destruction of Nagasaki, and he learns that it was not purely a military target, paraphrasing him, women, children, and old men died because of my actions. That is when he inaugurates this tradition of presidential non-delegation of nuclear weapon use, right? It has to be the president. Eisenhower plays around with it a little bit. He's more willing to delegate. He's a former, flag officer, the highest flag, other than Marshall, the highest in the Second World War. And but generally, it's been, you can call it a taboo or just a tradition that the executive branch is in charge because it gives rise to questions of the highest strategic magnitude. Now, all that being said, in 2023, nuclear weapon use increasingly as we do games, and this is Chatham House rules, but it's all just, this is, none of it touches on anything classified. When we do games, they are conflicts under the shadow of nuclear use, right? Because if you were thinking about our differences with Russia, right? 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads under the New START Treaty. You think of our differences with the People's Republic of China, a growing nuclear arsenal, according to open, right, source intelligence, basically satellites. You just can't avoid it. Nuclear deterrence is always happening. And you hope to God that you never get an actual use of nuclear weapons. But if that use were to occur, it always has strategic implications. But, it could also have theater level. It will have theater level implications too.
Well, and this tells us also about the evolution of the superpower relations in the post-Cold War period, that for a long time, I think, whether it's from 1991 in the Gulf War, but then after 2001 in the War on Terror, the nuclear threat that American policymakers were concerned with, correct me if you disagree, was not coming from another superpower. It was coming from a smaller threat.
Or failed states. Failed states too.
Yeah.
Concerns over loose nukes, Pakistan, a lot of Tom Clancy kind of narratives, if you will. Former Soviet nuclear scientists selling the bomb to, this person or that person. And the DoD, there's a lot of DoD speak that you learn when you work, right? I'm a U.S. Navy, I'm an employee, a civilian employee of the U.S. Navy now. And there's a lot of DoD speak, a lot of jargon, but the idea of a great power competition, that we now exist in an era of great power competition. Another way to define great power is nuclear weapon state, right? It's not exactly a synonym, but it's close.
That's a good correlation.
And so one thing, we've just stood up a new strategic deterrence institute at I work for the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, so it's kind of almost a think tank within the U.S. Naval War College. And I was one of two hires for this new deterrence institute, so that we could think through these issues of great power competition with nuclear adversaries, with nuclear peers. And when they interviewed me, one of the things they said is we really only have history to look to for guidance, and that numerous flag officers had essentially stated, we don't even know what we've forgotten from the Cold War. So I think that is where historians can assist, not always in drawing out lessons or analogies. More often than not, it's to sort of say, like, actually, no, that analogy is not only flawed, but misleading and perilous. But hopefully to give a sense of perspective and proportion. The challenges we face in 2023 are no more acute or ominous than they were in 1963. That doesn't mean we can't learn from them, but we can also hopefully put things in the right proportion when we connect it to historical knowledge.
But and I think that's a really great point, and a point to end on, I think, because it really does highlight, especially for not only for our own students at SMU, but for your students, in professional military education, the significance of understanding the depth of comparison. I mean, I was struck, and I know many of my colleagues in the history world were struck after 9/11 by the number of times that we heard a policymaker, a senator, some defense analyst talk about the existential threat that was the terrorist threat. Right. And you're rolling your eyes because those of us in the business would say, no, Cuban Missile Crisis, that was an existential threat. Not to diminish anything that happened in the war on terror, but let's get the proportions right in our conversations. And it's perhaps sad that we have to end on the note that conversation is becoming in vogue again. So, but
it is, and if I could remind our audience of one thing, we know how to manage these risks. We know how to manage nuclear risks, and part of the way, I hope I didn't give too grim of a picture of presidential leadership when it came to nuclear non-proliferation, because these were men and women who were very much concerned with a world that was stable, a world that would be prosperous, that a world that could avoid the kind of cataclysm of a third world war. But they were also leaders who perhaps created regimes that had certain second and third order effects that we're also living with the consequences of.
Well, Jonathan, this has been absolutely fascinating. I know our audience has really approved it from the comments I'm getting the back channel. So thank you for your time. We look forward to you next time back in Texas. And if I understand correctly, you're flying off to a carrier?
Yeah, I am. One of definitely the coolest thing I've gotten to do so far. They let me go on the bridge of what is it? I'm going to get it wrong now. One of the SSGNs, so one of the submarines, up in Groton Naval Base. But on Wednesday, I'm going to fly down to Norfolk and take a plane to the USS George Washington. So I'll get to spend 2 days on an active U.S. aircraft carrier, seeing how they, get 40 F-18s launched and returned in the course of 30 minutes.
Well, I don't want to try to, do comparisons or pull rank, but here at SMU, we're getting ready to go to a bowl game in Boston in late December. So,
hey,
one or the other. So
yeah, New Orleans for me. So
oh, okay. I set you up on that one. All right, buddy. Thanks a bunch for your time. And thank you everyone for tuning in to our webinar this evening. I look forward to seeing you. This is our last event of the fall. So I look forward to seeing you all in the spring and wish you all the warmest and happiest of holiday seasons. So thank you for your time and see you next time.